welcome back to the channel. Hope you're having a great day. I feel like my video last week about sound design got some pretty good responses, so this week I decided to do some more sound design and production focused content, this time around techno low ends. And for anyone that's interested, I resampled everything I made today and I'm going to make that available for free. I'll put a link in the description below for that. You heard the first example of what we're going through today in the intro, but I've got two other low ends that I made, both with different kinds of approaches and with different feels. And then I've made this drum group that's going to be the same across the whole video. It sounds like this. But let's go all three of these low ends and talk about how I made them. This first example that you heard in the intro is probably what I'd describe as more of a percussive techno low end. And it's made up of 4 different parts. All the kicks and toms from today's video are from my Overstayer drum sample pack. There's a link to that below if you want to have a look. But I've essentially just chosen a kick sample and done some pretty basic processing here. If you're familiar with the channel, you'll probably seen me use this trick before, where I use drum bus and the boom and decay controls to add a bit of sub weight to the kick. And I've cut out some of the knock and sort of muddiness just with a simple EQ cut at about 200 Hertz or so, and then scooped off the top end. I then wanted to add a little bit of sub sort of ambience underneath that kick in between the kick hits. So I added this sub sample. I just searched sub in the Ableton library. I'm assuming that this is from the Ableton library. And then just put in a single note for 1 bar. Then I've just adjusted the levels and I'm simply ducking that with a sidechain to the kick. I then added what's called a ghost kick. It's essentially just an offbeat kick in between the rhythm of the original kick, just to add a little bit more groove. All that I did to that kick sample was just scoop off the low end, and then I sidechained that to the main kick as well so that it ducks whenever that cuts through. And then finally, I've just added in these toms from that sample pack that I mentioned earlier, just to sort of fill in the space, fill in the groove. And that's running through a grain delay, just to add a bit of width and dimension to the low end. So this is quite a complicated low end. This isn't something that I do very often. Generally, I prefer pretty simple setups, which we'll see in the next example. But just like I said in my last sound design video, good sound design is all about building layers. So we've got the foundation of the kick and the sub, which are taking up that low end space, and the ghost kick and the toms, which are sort of playing above that kick and filling in the low end groove where it's possible. I'll use this snapshot of the whole low end group to kind of explain what I'm talking about. So the kick kind of dominates this frequency, 50 Hertz or so. When I'm adding different sounds to a low end group, I kind of want to play on either side of that. So you can see the sub is kind of dominating everything below the kick and perhaps just above the kick here as well. And then all of the upper harmonics are dominated by things like ghost kicks and toms. The approach that I try to take here is trying not to let more than one thing dominate a specific part of the low end. If we've got the most important part of the kick in a specific area, then we want the toms, bass, sub lines to sort of work on either side of that. We really don't want things competing with each other, because that's just going to make your project easier to mix once you've finished producing it. And this is what the second example sounds like. You can see I've followed those same principles that I just talked about. This is where our kick dominates and then our bass sort of hovers on either side of that. You can see there's a little bit of width and upper harmonics as the bass sort of moves around the kick. In this case, I used a different kick from my sample pack that didn't really need that EQ ducking, but I've followed the same kind of processing as the last one. Just added that boom from the drum bus, but then I've also added this saturator just to add some upper harmonics to the kick and bring out some of the drive. For the main bass line, I've used my hypnotic bass generator here, and I've just automated some parameters. I've mapped 2 LFOs here, one to the FM parameter here, and then another to the low pass filter. And I really drove the resonance up really high so that you get this sort of sweeping, resonant upper harmonic feel to the bass sound. The only other thing I did to this bass was map this pitch parameter within the MIDI clip, just to add a bit of pitch variation throughout the bar. Got the usual sidechain compression on that bass again. Then I just felt like it needed a little bit more groove, so I added this tom on the offbeat just to fill in the space a little bit and get this final result. If you want that bass generator that I used in this example, there's a link in the description below. And then this is the third and final example. For this one, I used a really popular and somewhat overused kick sample. It's this Alkaloid 2 kick. I believe it's from the Native Instruments battery sample pack. But if you're a fan of techno, chances are you've heard this kick in a track somewhere. Same processing as the first kick here, just a little bit more boom, and then took out some of that just knock and mud in the 200 Hertz region. And then I used a bit of a different technique to add some sub weight here. This is one of my favorite techniques when I want a little bit more control over this specific pitch and movement of my sub bass. Essentially just got operator set to a basic sine wave, and I've just kind of softened the attack by about 50 milliseconds, just so it's not too percussive. Then I just chose a really basic MIDI sequence here. Again, just choosing notes that sit below and above that main dominant frequency of the kick, so we're not getting any clashing. And then in this case, I actually ran the sub through a grain delay. Just set the pitch a little bit higher and spread it out with the spray. Dialed up the feedback a bit just so it filled out the stereo space a little bit more. One thing I will mention here is when you're adding stereo effects to your low end, just be cautious and careful of how much stereo width you're adding. Good habit to get into is whenever you're adding these kinds of effects is check the whole sound in mono and just make sure that you're not taking anything away by spreading the sound out. So in summary, the sub's just really adding a little bit more low end groove to the group because the kick on its own is kind of static. And then I just added this final bass just to make it a little bit more interesting. I use this Ableton Wavetable preset, Better Bounce Bass. Using presets in your sound design sessions is not a sin. It's great to find something that's close to what you're looking for and then using that basis to fit in with the rest of your track. In this case, I kept the changes pretty simple. I just modulated the oscillator 2 amount and the filter decay with our LFOs here. Then I just made a few changes to the way that the preset was playing back. I think I lengthened the attack a little bit and made some changes to the LFOs within the preset just to suit the sound that I was looking for a bit more. Then I just sort of used EQ8 to cut out what I didn't want and add back in what I did. The end result is this really cool and interesting evolving bass line. The reason why I think this particular bass works really well in combination with this kick and sub is because it adds a little bit of contrast. I think when you're talking about the context of a whole track, especially in a genre like techno where things are pretty minimal, contrast is super important. Any sort of low end that's just dominating a very specific small part of the frequency spectrum is probably a pretty boring one. You really need to fill in that space with other sounds. But in this case, I've used the bass to fill in a much larger part of the frequency spectrum and get a much more interesting basis to get an idea started. If you're a subscriber of the channel and you want more sound design and production focused videos, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to get your feedback. And if you're a producer and you've got some projects that you need some professional mixing and mastering help with, I've got a bit of time left in the studio this week. Contact me on my website, bookeraudio.com. I'd love to chat to you. But that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you learned something new and found some inspiration. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay creative.